All right, welcome back to the Cordell Cordell virtual town hall. Scott Trout, managing partner and CEO of Cordell Cordell. So today we're going to talk a little bit about celebrity divorces, and particularly Joe Jonas, Kevin Costner. I always find it interesting to look through those, discuss them, and I've always said divorce has commonalities no matter where you are, what you have, where you come from, where you live, around the world. There are all these commonalities. It just, as I was talking with our guests off camera, the only thing different is the ego and perhaps the amount of money that were involved. But when it comes down to it, the particulars, the way we go about it, perhaps even the evidence, the type of evidence that you'll want, and the process, and the in terms of what you're asking the court is the same. And we can all learn something from these two, and that's our intent today, is to talk a little bit about that. As always, since we're just talking in generalities about this, it's not legal advice. Don't take it as that. The only way to do that, the only way to obtain it, one, find an attorney who practices exclusively in family law, like we do at Cordell Cordell, with offices around the country, and certain to have one nearest you. You can go to CordellCordell.com. You can schedule an appointment right there from the website. And you can search it by entering your address or zip code, and it'll tell you the closest office. And you can pick an appointment right there without even having to pick up the phone. But if you'd rather, you can call us at 866-DADS-LAW as well, and you can schedule an appointment. That is the best way, the only way to get legal advice. That way we can have the facts, the circumstances, and be very specific and tailored for your case. So today we have two of our attorneys from Cordell Cordell. Let's start with Ashley in Pennsylvania. Welcome to the virtual town hall.
Hi, Scott. As Scott said, my name is Ashley Folio Morgan. I am out of the Cranberry Township office, which is just north of Pittsburgh. I have been doing family law exclusively for just over 13 years, and I've been with Cordell for just over 7. So most of my career has been here.
Thanks, Ashley. And rounding out the panel for today, in the land of beer, brat, and cheese in Wisconsin, welcome, Chelsea.
Hi, Scott. Thank you. I, as Scott said, am in Wisconsin. I'm based in our Milwaukee office. I also work out of our Madison office. I've been practicing a little over 11 years, and with Cordell over 7.5 at this point. So thank you for having me today.
Great. So we'll get to it, and we'll talk a little bit about Costner, talk a little bit about Joe Jonas. It's always interesting. I find it intriguing. Some of the issues sometimes are a little bit more complex, especially in these two when they have prenuptial agreements. We're going to talk a little bit about that and what that means, what it entails, and maybe it makes things move a little bit quicker. I mean, both of these, at least the Costner one, went pretty rapidly, albeit we'll talk about how much in fees they racked up, which is astonishing. But we'll be right back. We're going to take a very quick commercial break. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. Let's get right into it. Let's start with Joe Jonas. I think that's a good place, and that one isn't resolved as far as we know, and I think it's good to talk a little bit about that case. So basically, if you're not familiar, we have two kids within Joe Jonas, and that's really what we're talking or dealing with is some custody issues. They haven't said a lot about property simply because there is some information about being a prenuptial agreement, and that's why it doesn't seem as though property issues are in the news, nor is perhaps spousal support. But what I find interesting is this whole custody battle. I was writing some notes here as I was reading through it with these two kids. And one of the first things that came out, and I'll go to you, Chelsea, here on this, is, obviously Joe Jonas filed in Florida. And his, you have to believe his PR team started putting out some photos and maybe some leaking some information as to what was going on and why they separated. And one was she likes to party, he likes to stay at home, and there was some allegation that he caught her on Ring camera or some sort of video saying something that was the final straw. So the question, I guess, let's talk a little bit about Wisconsin. they're alluding to misconduct, perhaps. There were some allegations or some facts about she married so young, had children so young, and never really had an opportunity to live her best life. So does misconduct matter when it comes to divorce? And if so, what do you do in Wisconsin?
So I think we're looking at two different areas of the case in Wisconsin. So we are a no-fault state. So in terms of if property was at issue here, it wouldn't matter. But if we're talking about custody and placement, it may, if that misconduct has some impact on the kids. So is she exposing them to dangerous things, or is she, neglecting them, or just kind of not acting in their best interest? I think the thing that everybody wants to know is what was caught on that Ring camera, and is that going to be detrimental to those kids? And, is your state going to allow you to use that footage? I think is something that's going to be key here. We would be able to, we're a one-party consent state, so that would definitely make its way into the case.
It's interesting, the Ring camera, because I have that conversation quite often with some clients, especially when we're talking about maybe even allegations of adult abuse where there's an order of protection. Our client was served alleging that he struck and assaulted his wife. And she claimed that this all occurred in the driveway. And lo and behold, we had video of it on the Ring camera and showed just the opposite. She assaulted him. He didn't touch her. He backed away, took his phone out and called 911. So I find the use of the Ring camera to be interesting and useful. But, in terms of misconduct, there's two aspects, at least from my perspective in Missouri. You can use it for custody, but it has to have a direct correlation to it. And then also for property division. Now, we have a prenup. We'll talk about that, and it may become an irrelevant fact. But, again, you have to balance these celebrities when they're putting information out in the media. It may have nothing to do with the divorce. It may have everything to do with how they appear to the public, and he's playing victim, and his image is everything. But in Pennsylvania, Ashley, does misconduct matter? Can you use it in custody and property divorce?
Yeah, you certainly can. I think we're pretty similar to what Chelsea was talking about. We have fault-based divorces, but I can tell you in 13 years, I've had two, and both were dropped, but were filed against my client, and both were dropped because it just doesn't help. In terms of custody, we have 16 factors here. And the judge has to address all 16. So they can't just pick and choose, but they're allowed to give whatever weight they deem appropriate to each factor. So what's interesting here is we actually require that in our orders, the judge has to address every single factor. If they don't, it's immediately appealable, and the judge has to basically go back and fix it. Mm-hmm. But misconduct, again, similarly, if it's not affecting the children, it really depends what type. A lot of times we get the adultery issue, and that's why, our clients don't think the other party should have the children. And while that might be very true, there has to be something more to it. So are they doing something inappropriate when the children are around? Are they neglecting the children? If the answer is no to those two things, then misconduct doesn't matter, here either. Unless you can get it in, a child we have the well-reasoned preference of the child. So if the child's old enough and is determined to have a preference, misconduct could weigh on that in another way that isn't as obvious.
It is interesting. Many years ago, it's probably at least 10 years ago, I was on Dr. Phil opining about divorce and things that you shouldn't do and how you can use social media. It was the onset of social media. It was obviously more than 10 years ago. I've been doing this too long. And one of the things that Dr. Phil showed on the screen was some photos of a mom. There was alcohol bottles everywhere. She was partying. And then in the background, you had a child or a toddler in kind of a playpen. And, what do you do with that, right? And is she directly harming the child? Probably not. And we don't really know, but I was able to, say, okay, let's twist these facts the way I see them. She's having a party. Child's exposed to whatever is going on. She's obviously intoxicated, not able to fully care for the child, putting a child in a situation that is not in the best interest of the child, exposing to unknown strangers, not obviously not paying attention. And then maybe that is where Joe Jonas is saying, look, and I'm curious to your thoughts, Chelsea, is she's out partying all the time. She goes to bars all the time. She's living her best life, her PR people. So what do you think?
So I think what's interesting, like you said, we're the land of beer and cheese, and it is not uncommon to have the baby at the bar, if you will. And we regularly see parents come in and say, I want absolute sobriety provisions. And our judges are very hesitant to order that unless there is good cause. So unless there is drunk driving charges, and more so even drunk driving with kids involved, because they don't want to take away your abilities and your freedoms. And again, they want to see, is there some direct impact on a child? If you're able to parent and make smart choices. So I think what you were describing there with that photo of if mom is having a good time, but there is a responsible parent who's got their faculties about them, that if an emergency arises, someone can get behind the wheel and drive to the ER, is that really a problem? I think the other thing that we're seeing nowadays too, with the legalization of weed is, even going further than just the drinking, is ordering the drug tests. And how is that handled? Wisconsin, it's not legal here, but it's legal across the border in Illinois. And we're seeing judges go both ways on that. So I think it's something that's emerging, and it's sort of, you need to know your county, you need to know your specific judge, and really the facts of your case and how it plays out in that family dynamic. And I think sometimes you can be really risky to make a big deal out of something if it's not actually a big deal, because it can really buy you bad faith with the court.
You make a good point, talking about maybe community standards or regular things where you have children, infants in a brewery. And I can tell you firsthand, being up in Milwaukee, that's not something I was used to seeing. And there's just an abundance of younger families with their babies or children running around in the brewery. You just would never see that where I live, ever. And nor would it be allowed. And so it's common practice. Now, so the judges, I think it's a good point, is the judges go, yeah, of course you can bring your child out to this brewery, because that's what we do in Wisconsin. It's a celebration, whatever it may be. So it is interesting in terms of what you can use and how you use it. But Ashley, we were talking off camera before this started about this very issue, about maybe Joe's saying, I'm the primary, look at me, I'm the stay-at-home, intimating I'm the stay-at-home dad. There's some notes pretty much saying that he's pretty much caring for them all of the time. That quote can come back to haunt him, because we were just talking about how he's on tour, and he was in Pennsylvania, right?
Right. Yeah, he was in Pittsburgh, I think, on the 25th, Kentucky on the 26th, and he's in North Carolina on the 28th. What I think is interesting about this case, that it's much larger scale, but it still applies to almost every case I've got now with social media, is they put out that amicable statement, right? Like the uncoupling statement, kind of, as it's become known. And then immediately they both kind of went on PR. I think Sophie stepped back a little bit, but we've seen it. I'm sure if you haven't seen Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, you've seen Sophie and Taylor Swift out to lunch. But he immediately put a picture out with what I was assuming was his caregiver and both children. And I kind of see that more, his band, the Jonas Brothers, are on tour. And they're moving quite frequently. So I almost see that as him trying to show that even though he's on tour, it's kind of like how we sometimes with our clients deal with bad facts by getting it out there ahead and not letting opposing party get in. I kind of see that as the same thing, where this is not the greatest fact for him. He's on I think it's just within the US, but I'm sure it'll go international. So he's trying to be out ahead and say, oh yeah, I'm on tour, but look, I'm still at breakfast with my kids. And then she responded with, obviously she went out to lunch with one of his exes who has famously written many songs about him, that she's on good terms with her. And so I think that we see that in even our cases. And that's one of the things that I'm always so cautious with my clients on is, no, we're not Joe Jonas, Sophie Turner, Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce, no matter how much we want to be. But we still have our own little bubbles of, whether it's your family. And I think the dangerous thing for our clients or sometimes useful, is you don't always remember who your thousands of or hundreds of Facebook friends are. And I guarantee, even if you try to scrub everybody, you still probably have her second cousin twice removed who can see your Facebook posts.
Yeah.
So while they did it with probably very expensive PR people, I think that applies to our clients too. And like, one, on the trying to get out ahead of some bad facts maybe, but also just being very aware of the social media imprint you have.
Yeah. And it's one thing, and I think, and we were alluding to it, and I said it early on, there's a balance between his PR team trying to maintain whatever, picture his fans and, the people that like what he does, appear to see with him. And by saying, for example, she likes to party, he likes to stay at home. There's a different side when you say that in court on the stand. And I could cross-examine him and say, well, actually, you don't stay at home now, do you, Mr. Jonas? Because you were in Pittsburgh, then you were in Kentucky. And then where were your kids while you were on stage preparing for the last 12 hours? They weren't with you. Now, were they? In fact, you don't care for them. That you hire someone to do that. And Sophie is fully capable of doing that. I mean, you can blow your case apart when you make those statements at trial. And so I think there is this balance. That's kind of what we're learning, albeit, like you said, all of this does apply to, Joe on Main Street who's watching and listening to this, and that it is very appropriate and it does apply. These same things, and I said you could have a firefighter who has perhaps one of the more difficult schedules to deal with when it comes to custody. It may be a 90-day schedule or a 60-day schedule, overnights, days, and it varies. And you want to be the primary. You want to be the sole caretaker. That's a challenge. So for you to say in that instance, well, my wife likes to party and I like to stay at home and take care of the kids, that's not necessarily true because you're at the firehouse, 2 weeks at a time or whatever it may be. So I think that's why I think looking at this case is so interesting, because it does have some of the issues that everybody's going to have: custody, using video, using photos, portraying yourself as what role have you played historically? What role has, your spouse, your partner played to kind of support that or not support it? It invokes every factor in custody, regardless of how much money Joe Jonas has, regardless of his fame and power. It doesn't matter. These issues, that's why I like him. So that gives us a chance here to pivot to talk about Kevin Costner, which I think is equally fascinating from a whole different level in terms of where they have 3 kids and they're younger, from 16 to 13, it looks like. And what's interesting here is that one has become very, very public in terms of, and ugly in some regards, in terms of child support. The issues have not necessarily been who's going to get custody, but it's how much money is Kevin going to pay, who's going to live where, getting out of the house. One of my top 10 mistakes guys make when facing divorce is moving out, but that's not necessarily the issue here. Going what I call off chart, depending upon formula, I want to ask you about that. Joint legal custody, that really hasn't been said, but I get that that's potentially an issue in the Costner case. And then attorney's fees, crazy numbers. And I alluded that in the opening statement, that it's just the amount of money. It certainly isn't cheap to get divorced. So let's talk about that. Chelsea, kind of off the front, we were talking about child support before we got on camera. The demand that was crazy, it was something like $248,000 a month. And I looked online. It looks like they settled, or not, didn't settle. The judge ordered only 63,000 only. I should stop that. I should never say only 63, because I'm equally astonished at that number to raise 3 children. But how is child support calculated in Wisconsin?
So child support in Wisconsin is a formula based on your placement schedule. And we have 2 main types of placement here. Primary, where if one parent has 75% or more, then it's only the non-primary parent's income. And if you have at least 25%, then it's both of your incomes and your overnights. So ours does give you a deviation if you're a high income earner. So at least if you're making $7,000 a month gross or more, you kind of get a reduction for each kind of chunk of income above that. But that reduction sort of stops at a certain point. And we're also seeing courts let us take the wheel there and pitch deviations after that. because they understand nowadays there's so many creative ways that people are paid, and outside of the box, we're not all salary W-2 employees anymore.
Yeah. It's you haven't heard a word in the Costner case about spousal support, maintenance, or at least if it has been mentioned, I haven't seen a lot of talk about it or conversation, simply because maybe the prenup controls. But I surmise that this number, this crazy number, has built into it the lifestyle of his wife, Christina, and trying to understand how in the world, and I think we all sit here and think, how in the world can it cost $63,000 a month to raise 3 children? It's astonishing to me. And I get it. A lifestyle comes into play. But that just seems to me, and I'm curious, Ashley, your thoughts, it seems like the judge saying, I'm just going to give spousal support without giving spousal support and maintain the standard of living for all 4 of them.
Right. I mean, I think what I read was, I think he paid her out like $1 million, which I was assuming was probably, I think it was part of the premarital agreement. I took that as whatever the maintenance. I know a lot of times we put in settlement agreements, if they're married for X amount of years, this is what they'll get. So in Pennsylvania, we do have, our guideline goes over what we do if people make more than a net of $30,000 a month. So we don't have, there's discretion. But where the discretion comes in for us is things like private school, which I believe all 3 of these children are in private school. I read something that there was a private plane cost that was being included, which is mind blowing, but it happens, and I think a lot of those things, that's where our kind of spousal support would come back in, because it's not just these 3 kids flying by themselves, it's mom. Some of the other private chef, housekeeping, all of that stuff, I think is where in our state, it could potentially come back in. I have housekeepers in support case, claims and support cases. And what do we do with that? To me, seeing her original ask of like $248,000 down to kind of, I don't know if it was agreed or court ordered. I think they entered an agreement. The court put it in an order of like $63,000 is telling to probably what she was trying to include versus what the court found was reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. The biggest amount I've had when I was practicing in Georgia, we were modifying at the trial level. Our client was ordered to pay like $23,000 a month, and we got it reduced down to $5,000 or $6,000 a month. Even then, you just have to think at school age kids, it's just a crazy number. But so how it relates, if you ignore the number, the point being is working with the chart, and there are options, for example, in Missouri, where we can go off chart, up, down, whatever it may be. And so oftentimes I hear of attorneys who just say, well, the chart is the chart. The calculation's the calculation. That's what you're going to have to pay. Well, Missouri has all kinds of case law and abilities to argue off chart. You can argue for the number of overnights that you have. You get a larger discount in terms of your child support, or because there's this thing called duplicative costs. Each of you have these costs that incurred when you have custody. And so I imagine you can go and have that deviation amount up, down in Wisconsin, Chelsea, right?
So ours is fairly limited on what we can deviate for, because we split our variables. If you have shared placement, is separate from our support amount. So there is a little bit of case law to deviate our support if you are then contributing to those. But it's actually really hard here to get those deviations to go outside the guidelines. Again, you have to have that sort of anomaly of an income where you go, no kid needs 60,000 plus a month in support. I also think it sort of factors in that our cost of living here is generally not that high, and I don't believe have any type of schools that cost that much. But on the whole, it takes a lot to get a big deviation on support, unless it's by agreement of the parties here. That would be typically something reserved for our maintenance arguments.
And I think the point and the moral of the story is this is a really good reason to have a consultation and say, okay, what are my options here across the country? Every state's different. Some states don't allow it, or they're very difficult to go off chart or to deviate. While others, you can, here in Missouri, you can easily go off chart, and there are good justifications for it, and good arguments to support it. And especially you can go through the actual expenses of the children. I mean, it depends on your judge, obviously, and depends on your state. But I think that's the moral of the story when we think about Kevin Costner. But lastly, with the few minutes that we have left, I want to talk about Ashley is moving out. One of the main contentions here, albeit it had encompassed some of the provisions in the prenuptial agreement, was that Christina lived in one of his homes that was clearly, or at least clearly identified in the prenuptial agreement as his separate property, and some provision about getting her out. It took a lot to get her out. I get it. The judges are reluctant to move a spouse, especially if they're going to take custody of the children, out and maintain status quo. But let's talk a little bit about, at least in Pennsylvania, about moving out. It's one of my top 10 mistakes guys make in divorces, themselves moving out, especially if they want the house or they want access. So maybe talk about, how do you get a spouse out if you're living together? Forget that you're living in separate homes, because most of our clients don't have 10 homes that you can pick one and live in, like Kevin is afforded, which is wonderful for Kevin. But how do you get a spouse out of the house? Can you do it in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, it's not easy in Pennsylvania. And most of my initial consultations will have people who have read enough, have read the 10 Biggest Mistakes book, or that say, oh, I'm not supposed to leave the house because it'll be abandonment. And I'm always real quick in Pennsylvania, abandonment takes much longer. That's not why we don't want you to leave the house. And I'll always say to clients, like, look, the concern is there could be a protective action. We call them PFAs in Pennsylvania, where with very little, no evidence, just a party saying, I'm afraid of them because of this, and being convincing, you could get kicked out of your house. So I'm very quick to tell my clients, make sure all of your sentimental things are safe. Make sure your passport, birth certificate, have them somewhere else. Have a kind of go bag, for lack of a better term, in case that happens. But in situations on the other side where we're trying to get another party out of the house, we have what's called exclusive possession, where we have to do a motion. Typically, there's a hearing, unless it's a very clear case, where they have two houses and one party can go to one and the other, which again is rare, but it happens. What more often happens is a party leaves the house and then wants to come back once they realize that rent is more expensive than mortgage, or they can't get the 3-bedroom that the house has. So we do run in pretty quickly to try to get exclusive possession. The hard part in Pennsylvania, and it depends on your judge and how much they kind of know or where their little quirks are, is there has to be some fear related, or instability or concern for safety in order to grant exclusive possession. Not every judge requires that, but you have to plead it in your petition for exclusive possession. And then at the hearing, the court decides. The other side of that is, in Pennsylvania, our divorce code states whoever's in the house pays all the bills associated with the house. So, we have some cases where, it might be really nice that one party wants the house, but if they can't afford it, we don't necessarily want to get exclusive possession and have to pay all of the bills associated with it. So, that's the only legal recourse. And as I tell clients, I think a lot of people are internet attorneys and will say, oh, he's out, he can't come back in. And I always tell clients, she can change the locks, you can kick down the doors. Unless there's an exclusive possession order in Pennsylvania and that house is in joint name. And even if it's not, most times, if it's marital, you can go back in. The police aren't going to do anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's difficult in Pennsylvania.
So interesting. It's one of those things where we talk about moving out. And to me, that decision's made early, whether you move out, you get her out, she leaves. That's another reason to have a consultation. And because every decision has a material effect in the case. Every statement that you make has a material effect. And that's why when we do these in the book, and I do this seminar, 10 Stupidest Mistakes, I start off with number 10 being moving out, because it has so many consequences associated with it. And it creates so many problems until you get someone out or you move out. So unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to end today, where we talk about celebrity divorces, and we could keep going on. It's wonderful because all the issues are the same issues that everybody has, that, middle America has. So Chelsea, Ashley, thanks for joining and kind of giving us insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
Well, tune in next month for the same thing. We're going to talk about topics on divorce, family law, modifications. You'll want to join. You'll want to come in and hear some information. But if you want more, go ahead and go to our website, CordellCordell.com. You can schedule an appointment. You can do it via Zoom, Teams, online, or in person, on the phone, whatever it may be. You can do that now, or call Dad's Law. So until next time, have a great rest of the week.